Hi.
Hi. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started with introductions. I know we'll probably have some folks joining us over these first few minutes. But first off, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to keep everybody on mute except for Felicia and I, just so we don't get feedback. If you have a question during the presentation, though, we'll be happy to take you back off mute. But if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself on mute for now, that would be helpful. My name is Jessica Foreman. I'm the president of the Austin Area League. And Felicia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Felicia Miyakawa. I'm president of the Williamson County League.
Yes, so we're covering not all of Central Texas, but a big chunk, right? And I see we have a good mix of folks on here tonight. So a few things before we get started. We're going to go through the different offices and talk about the duties and roles and what you might want to be thinking about when you're voting for those positions. We're not, however, going to talk about specific candidates. But if you do want to learn about specific candidates, you can pick up a voter's guide or go to Vote 411, which has all of that information available. We also want this to be as interactive as it can be virtually. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. If you have a longer question that you don't want to type out, you can use the reaction to raise your hand and we can take you off of mute and you can ask that question as well. Just so you know, this session is being recorded and we will put this on our YouTube. So if you do ask a question, that will end up on the recording. So what's on the ballot? We have the 2024 primary election coming up. A few things about the League of Women Voters, in case you're not familiar, is that we are nonpartisan. We do not support parties or candidates, which is why we're specifically talking about duties and roles and what issues might be happening underneath those particular elected offices. Also, just to note, Felicia and I are just regular people as well who work in this space, but we're definitely not the experts of everything we're going to be covering. So keep that in mind, and certainly you may be able to stump us with a question in the chat. But if you do ask something we don't know the answer to, we can probably find the answer and get back to you later. All right. So to give you a roadmap of what we're going to cover today, we've broken the different offices down into 4 categories that I think might help us make sense of what you want to be thinking about in regards to who you want to vote for. Policymakers, law enforcement, and that's going to be what we traditionally think is law enforcement, but also prosecutors. And then judges get their own category and something we're calling public administrators. This is a little bit of a catch-all for the county and state offices that kind of head up big administrative departments. And we do want to hear from you. So we are going to have some discussion questions that we hope you will share some answers in the chat. And like I said, please feel free to hop in with a question at any time. You're going to see some recurring themes on what are the hot topics with these offices and stakeholder relationships. A lot of county offices and local offices have to really work with different groups to get things going and moving. And there's also sometimes a contentious relationship between counties and the state. If you live in Travis County, you're probably aware of that. There are limited resources. If we all were to write down every single thing we care about, we're going to come up with a very long list. But the fact is that there's a limited amount of time, political will, and especially money. So you may want to be looking for candidates that really prioritize the issues you care about, because even if your issue is number 30 on their list and they agree with you, it might not be the thing they're most excited to get past. Tough decisions and a politically tricky environment. Politics is, I mean, this is not news to anyone on the call, but it is getting trickier and trickier. And so it has to be people that can handle that and that can kind of work in that environment. Management skills. A lot of these offices have huge staffs, have HR issues, have efficiency needs. So can this person manage their office? And of course, integrity, ethics, and demeanor. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what those words actually mean to voters and to us. So Felicia, can you kind of give us the lowdown on what is a primary election and how it's different than the general?
Yes, absolutely. So the primary election is when we vote on who we want to represent us in political parties for the general election ballot in the fall. When I go and talk to high school students, I describe it as a choose your fighter for the general election. So this election, the primary election, is partisan by nature. And by that, I mean, you need to decide in advance which party's primary you're going to participate in. Sometimes when people go to the polls and vote in a primary election, they're a little bit intimidated because the poll workers will ask you, which ballot do you want? That is a normal part of the process because the poll workers need to know which ballot to load on your screen or which machine to send you to. So before you go to the polls, what you need to decide is what party are you going to vote in, which party's primary election. And for this election that's happening on March 5th, it's only the Democratic and Republican parties holding a primary election. For the other two major parties, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, they will choose their candidates at the summer conventions. So in Texas, we have what's called an open primary system. And that means that when you register to vote, you are not registering with a particular political party. You're simply registering to vote. And when it comes time for a primary election, you may choose whichever party's primary you want to participate in. And then you go and you vote on that ballot. Here's the tricky thing. If there are any runoffs for the primaries, you can only participate in a runoff for the same party. So if you voted in the Democratic primary and there are some really exciting runoffs in the Republican primary, you can't participate in that, and vice versa. And if we do have any runoffs, those will happen on May 28th. The other piece of this is that if you participate in a party's primary, you are then eligible to go to the convention in the summer, the state convention. So this summer, the parties will hold a convention. So people who are super nerds about political parties might be excited, like, yay, I get to go to a convention. If that's not you, then don't worry about it. All you're doing is participating in the primary and making your voice heard. And in some counties, not necessarily ours, but in some counties, the primary election ends up being the most competitive election you'll compete in during the year because one party or another holds most of the offices and those races are uncontested. So the only time you have to really weigh in on who's going to be on the ballot is during the primary. So it's just something to think about as you're approaching how you want to vote. If you want to be strategic about it, if you want to align yourself with a party, those are all options for you. So as we go through the slides, when we talk about what offices are up for election in this primary election, we will be indicating whether or not there are races on the ballot in certain primaries, because in some cases, there are not people running in that primary, but it still means there's going to be people in this fall. It's just not contested in this primary.
All right, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just an illustration of the different categories that we're going to talk about and some things you might be thinking about throwing in your pot, percolating. For a public administrator is what kind of experience? What are your priorities? What kind of demeanor do they have? What are their management skills? A criminal and civil justice, your opinion on criminal justice, which we'll talk about, their background, their demeanor, and on policymakers, where you want your money spent, how you want your money raised, i.e. taxes, and your priorities as well. Policymakers. So this is the group that I feel like most people are familiar with and most people kind of think about ahead of time to vote on. While we're going through these slides, our discussion question for this category is going to be, what's your number one policy issue this year when thinking about voting for a policymaker? Obviously, there's no right answer to that. It is just particular to you. So if you want to be thinking about that, then at the end, if you would be willing to share, we'll read some answers out from the chat. So we have a US Senate race and several US representative races. The US Senate has a 6-year term, approves or rejects presidential appointees. Hello, Kitty.
Yeah.
Oversight of the federal budget and proposes federal legislation. Okay. And then US representatives, of course, are 2-year terms. They all get elected every 2 years. They can impeach federal officers. That's something that's been in the news frequently in the last 10 years. And they initiate all revenue bills, i.e. tax bills. And they also propose federal legislation. So when you're thinking about these, you want to think about what's your number one issue that you would want the federal government to talk about. Okay. There are folks running in both the GOP and the Democratic ballot. We do have an incumbent GOP, but it is also a competitive race. There's a second person running against Ted Cruz that you can read about in the voter's guide. And the Democratic ballot has a lot of folks running, and many of them filled out the voter's guide. So really good info there. Okay. And then, Felicia, what do y'all have going in Wilco?
Sure. So the next step down in terms of federal offices are our congressional races. And as Jessica said earlier, every 2 years, these congressional races are up. It doesn't matter. It's not on a 6-year cycle. It's a 2-year cycle. So we have 4 congressional districts in our county, and every single one of these will be on the primary ballot. So, oh, goodness gracious. So if you want to vote on the Democratic ballot and you're in, for example, in District 17, which is my district, you might have at least one person on the ballot, same with the GOP ballot. So again, you can use the voter's guide to look at what is your district. You can actually put in your address and it will tell you what your district is and who's running, and you can compare which candidates are on that particular, if it's on the GOP ballot or the Democratic ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. And the congressional races in Travis County, you do really want to look up which one you're in, because Travis County and Williamson a little bit, it's very interesting how the congressional districts are set up. It looks like a squiggly monster. You might be in a congressional district with Brenham or Fredericksburg or the Valley. So you want to look it up to see. Also, when we say someone's running on the GOP or Democratic ballot, that doesn't necessarily mean there's more than one person running. It could just be one. But you always have the choice, right? There's always 2 choices, which is vote for that person or elect to not vote for that person. So we've included them for you to think about that too. Then we have the policymakers at the state level. So we have the state Senate, which that body is made up of 31 senators in different districts. They propose laws, pass the state budget, and appropriate funds for the state government. And then state representatives, which are elected every 2 years. There's 150 members of them, and they also appropriate funds and propose laws and amend laws as well. Felicia?
Yes, Williamson County, you can see on the map there the way that our districts are organized, and we have 3 House districts that are up for election: District 20, 52, and 136. We don't have a Senate position up this time. Our Senate is District 5, and that was 2 years ago. So this is, but all 3 of our representatives are up.
Right, and here is the representatives for Travis County, and you can kind of see the map. It's a little hard to see this zoomed in, And not all of the GOP have candidates running. Some of the more central districts only have people on the Democratic ballot. But most of the outer districts have both. And there's one state Senate district up as well. So representatives cover a broad range of topics. And we had some folks post about what's your number one policy issue this year when thinking about voting for either a state or US representative or senator. Someone mentioned their position on women's reproductive rights. Obviously, that is a very big topic going on in the news. And these are the exact offices that will pass things surrounding that issue. Does anybody else want to post other ideas you're thinking about when you're considering voting for senator or representative? We'll kind of move on to our third group of policymakers, but please still put that in the chat and we'll go back and read those too. So this group of policymakers is the one we often forget out of the three, but it's actually the county level policymakers. And I think it's because they have a very interesting title, which it doesn't, it's not so intuitive what they do, but it's the county commissioner. So each county is made up of a commissioner's court, and it's not a court how we think of like a trial court where you get charged with something. It functions more like a city council. So you have the county judge who sits at the head of it. In some counties, particularly like rural counties, that county judge actually hears cases. But in Williamson and Travis, all that county judge does is sit at the head of commissioner's court. So it's kind of like the mayor of the county. Now, they don't like it when we say that. They like to say, no, the mayor is the county judge of the city. But you and then every county in the state is made up of 4 commissioners that are in different districts, and 2 run in the presidential year and 2 run in the governor's year. So the main things they're responsible for are roads in the county, roads and bridges. They pass the budget for the county. So all the different offices, the sheriff, the county tax assessor, the elections office, all of their money comes from a vote by the county commissioners. And they can also pass laws. Now, they can't pass any laws that contradict with the state or the US. So usually you're looking at like land use and things like that. And so the question here is, what priorities do you want for your neighborhood? So if you're thinking about policy issues, but more for like Travis County and Williamson County. Okay. Also, they set the tax rate. The tax assessor always wants us to say they do not set the tax rate. The county commissioner's court does. So what are the issues that are kind of the hot topics there? Well, property tax, right? That is probably the highest. We have a very high property tax burden in Texas. So they actually set the property tax burden or parts of it, not the school district now, just the county. So city would be the council. School district would be the ISD, but they will set the county tax rate. The relationship between county and state and county and city, and maybe even county and county, because sometimes, you know, the commissioner's court in Williamson County and Travis County might back and forth a little bit on certain issues like people experiencing homelessness, for example. Transportation is their big thing. That's where a lot of their money goes. They're the ones that are going to pass bonds to build roads. Land use, including water planning, flooding, and fire is a big one. Criminal justice reform, they fund police, not city police, but they would fund constables and the sheriffs and the prosecutor's office as well. And emergency services, I think this is a really big one for Williamson County, where we had areas that were rural and suddenly are kind of urban and being a little weighty there. So you've got 2 offices up in Williamson, right, Felicia?
That's correct, yes. Precinct 1 is up, and there is somebody on, it is the incumbent who is on the Democratic ballot. And there's nobody running on the Republican side now for the primary. So the inverse is true for precinct 3. So again, it just depends on it. You don't get to choose oh, I want to vote in precinct 1 or I will want to vote in precinct 3, you vote in whatever precinct you're in. So for example, I live in precinct 4 and there is no county commissioner on my ballot this year. So it will just show up on your ballot. And again, you can choose which party you want to participate in.
And just like we said, there are 2 up as well, 1 and 3 in Travis County. Nobody on the GOP ballot, but we have folks on the Democratic ballot. So thinking about that all the way up to the US Senate, all the way down to Commissioner's Court, what are the issues that are really important to you? I'm particularly interested if you have a county issue that you think you would be interested in sharing. We have another one, someone else says reproductive rights, that's my top issue too. And LGBTQ plus rights is at the top for me, closely followed with reproductive freedom. Anything else? Some things I've heard, not quite as in the news a lot, but Austin had a big fire audit and we came out as one of the, Austin and Williamson, like the greater Austin area, as one of the areas in the United States most at risk for fire to a big city. Very surprising. So that would be this office kind of handling things like that. Water, always a really big issue, right? They will kind of manage water as well. Walkability, sidewalks, something Travis County is pretty notorious for not having a good hold on. Anything else? Okay, well, we'll kind of move on. Parks. Parks is another big one that the county does. To the law enforcement races. So we often think about these as sheriff. We will cover that, but there's going to be some more that maybe you're less familiar with. First, though, I think what's really confusing about law enforcement offices is because there are a bunch of them and they overlap jurisdictions and you vote on some and you don't vote on others. So what's the difference between the police, the sheriff, and the constable? So if you live in Austin or Cedar Park or Round Rock or any city, you might have a city police department. And those are not elected. The chief of police is not elected. They're appointed generally by the city council, or it could be by the city manager, depending on how it's set up in each city. So they're not elected and they only police the city that they reside in. Sheriff is over the county. So they would police. So one thing is all law enforcement officers have the jurisdiction to arrest you if you're breaking the law anywhere, even if you're not in the city limits and they're APD, right? They just don't investigate or go out looking for that necessarily. So the sheriff is going to take care of all the areas that are in Travis County, but not in the city of Austin. But additionally, they are going to manage the county jail. The Austin Police Department sends people to the county jail. So this is kind of where everyone's going in the county. That is a huge undertaking. In Williamson County, same way, the county jail takes in people from Round Rock and unincorporated areas and everywhere. Constables are in different precincts. There is, I believe, 4 in Williamson County and there are 5 in Travis County. And one of their main things is they serve process for the courts. So they might serve a citation that says that, Jessica, you have to come into the court tomorrow, you're being sued, or there's a divorce or something else. They also execute on properties that say the court says you actually owe this property to Felicia, then they would come and kind of handle the sale of that property or the transfer. And they would also evict people if actually move their stuff out if they hadn't got out during an eviction. They also can do law enforcement duties, and each of these groups often have memorandums of understanding with each other. So they might say, here we're going to let the constables do traffic police, and APD is going to do murder investigations, and the county is going to put boats out on the water and make sure there's no one drunken boating, right? So they kind of all come up with these agreements, but the only ones that are elected are the constable and the sheriff. And so while we're going through this, be thinking about what law enforcement issues you care about. So a sheriff, and all of this information we're putting is from the Texas Association of Counties, kind of like an organization that represents all the county officials. So they're a licensed peace officer, i.e. they've taken training to be a peace officer. They operate the county jail. They provide security for the courts. and they serve warrants and civil papers. So what are the issues in law enforcement? Well, there's been a whole lot of discussion nationwide about what the role of law enforcement is in our communities. Do we want more policing? Do we want less policing? Do we want different kinds of policing? And so you may have a very strong opinion on that, and that might then influence who you select for these positions. Mental health, huge issue. What kind of training and what kind of emphasis do the candidates put on mental health? Sexual assault cases was a very big deal in Austin a few years ago when there was a huge backlog of rape kits that hadn't been tested that just kind of sat there. And so if that's an issue you really care about, like, is that happening efficiently? Is it being investigated appropriately? Ethics and accountability. Obviously, you want the folks that are doing the arresting and enforcing the law to be very ethical. Efficiency and the courts, like court security, domestic violence. Law enforcement handles a lot of domestic violence and family violence issues. And also people experiencing homelessness and how law enforcement interacts with them. So for the constables, there's also sheriff and constables up in Williamson, right, Felicia?
Yes, absolutely. We have the sheriff in office right now, and we have folks on both ballots for the sheriff's office. And then for the constables, we have candidates on the GOP ballot for all 4 of the precincts, but not on the Democratic side. So some of these will be contested and some will not in the fall. But for now, again, it depends on what precinct you live in, and then you can choose which ballot. The sheriff, I should say, there is an incumbent and he is running for re-election. So that is something to know.
Yeah, similar in Travis County, except we don't have anybody running on the GOP ballot for any of these positions. Felicia mentioned in the beginning that some counties, not Williamson really, but in Travis, certainly the more competitive races are generally in the primary in general, at least for county on down races. But we do have someone on the Democratic ballot for all of these positions. Okay, district attorney. This is probably what I would say is the hottest race in Travis County. And what I mean by that is the one that's in the news the most. So you may have heard a little bit about it. So what is a district attorney? It's kind of like the head prosecutor of the county, okay? And they're going to prosecute felony cases. So there's 2 categories of cases. There's misdemeanors, and those are less serious, anything from a traffic ticket to some things that are more serious, but they don't quite reach the level of felony, which are considered state jail crimes, i.e. you can go to prison for them. They work with law enforcement officers and they investigate the criminal cases before they bring charges or when they're deciding to bring charges. They present cases to a grand jury. They represent victims of violence and protective orders and represent the state in removing children from abusive households. So they're the big prosecutor for the county. Now they do felonies. There's the second prosecutor, the county attorney, that prosecutes misdemeanors and also serves as the representative for the county, i.e. if the county gets sued, the county attorney represents them in civil issues, so not criminal, but civil. So they prosecute misdemeanor criminal cases. They work with law enforcement the same. So they provide legal advice to the commissioner's court and to other elected officials. There was a big bill passed at the state recently that said, counties, you can't pass certain laws. Like the big one that was talked about a lot was requiring water breaks in the summer, right? And so I would imagine a law passed that Travis County, Williamson County, they called in their county attorney and they said, hey, are we breaking the law? Are we out of law? How do we fix this? And if the state would have sued the county attorney would be the prosecutor, or not prosecutor, but the entity representing Travis County or Williamson County. So that's what it means, bring civil enforcement actions on behalf of the state or county. So what are the issues? The big one in the DA race in Travis County is prosecuting police and misconduct cases. One thing about prosecution is that this is a really hot topic nationwide, okay? There's a lot of conversations about what prosecution should look like, and it's changing everywhere. And so if you think of it as a scale, there's people on this end that says, hey, we have been over prosecuting crimes. We've been prosecuting too many, and we've also been putting people in prison for too long, and we need to do less prosecution. On the other end of the scale, you have people saying, we've been under prosecuting. We need to do more prosecuting because people are getting off and they're going out and recommitting crimes or committing different crimes, and it's causing crime to rise. And then you have people who are kind of in the middle, and they maybe say, we've been over prosecuting this kind of crime and under prosecuting this kind. And so you often hear folks say we've been over prosecuting drug crimes, for example. But under the under prosecution, some people feel that law enforcement has been under prosecuted and we need to move the pendulum a little bit. So the DA race, this is an extremely hot topic in Travis County. You have two candidates who kind of have opposing views on this. So however you feel, that can help you select who you want there.
Yeah.
Drug possession, do we want to prosecute for misdemeanor marijuana? That's a hot topic right at this second because the AG is actually suing Travis County because we haven't been prosecuting on this issue. Managing stakeholder relationships. Now you heard that prosecutors have to work with law enforcement to investigate crimes. So you kind of want them to have a good relationship with law enforcement. And they also represent victims. So you want them to handle how they interact with victims in a very respectful way. Penalties for misdemeanors, are they allowing diversion programs? Diversion program is a way to kind of, instead of being convicted and serving time for something, you can follow this certain prescription. Like, for example, if you have a DUI, driving under the influence, instead of going to prison, the diversion program might say something like, if you use a breathalyzer in your car and you go to drug and alcohol classes for 6 weeks and you don't get another ticket, then we will not prosecute you on this. So it's a way for people to kind of fix the issue without facing jail time. Specialty courts, prosecutors are a major part of that, like if mental health court, for example. And then state of Texas versus county, the relationship between the Travis County DAs for many years, not just the current DA, has been a bit antagonistic with the state. Maybe less so in Williamson County, but you never know, right? Okay, so we've got some up in Williamson, right?
Yes, we don't have anybody on the Democratic ballot for district attorney, but we do have somebody on the Republican ballot, and we've got candidates on both ballots for county attorney. There is an incumbent in both cases running on the GOP ballot.
In Travis County, like I said, we have this really hot race in the district attorney. One thing I really appreciate about all the candidates that ran for district attorney is they're really putting out there what they believe in this. I also much prefer for people to be very honest and say, this is what I'm going to do, instead of kind of trying to be neutral and make it a little confusing for voters. So there's some really strong opinions on this race, and I think that will probably make it a little easier for you to select just based on how you believe and feel prosecution should work going forward. The county attorney only has a race in the Democratic ballot. So okay, so I'm going to clear up some questions that came from the last group, but does anybody want to place in the chat, what law enforcement issues do you care about? We went over a whole bunch of different ones. Is there one that you said, that really speaks to me, or that's something I'm very passionate about? To go back up, it looks like we have something for the policymakers, which is HOA regulations and how those are handled. And you are correct. I'm pretty sure that would be state senate and state representatives that make laws about how HOAs can run. HOAs used to really be able to be little fiefdoms, and in the last several sessions, they have started passing different laws that more regulate HOAs. So if that's something you're really passionate about, you'd want to reach out or look at your state rep or a state senator. Question about what precinct I'm in. I believe you can find that information on Vote 411. And we've also got another comment there that you can go to lwvaustin.org and select advocacy and then your elected officials and type in your address to see who your representatives are. Thank you for that. Anyone want to add a law enforcement issue you care about? Felicia?
Jessica, can I just step in and say about the precinct issue? This is one of those terms that are quite confusing because we use the word precinct at several levels of elected officials. So at the very basic neighborhood level, we have precincts, which if you're working with a political party, they might elect precinct chairs to sort of, get out the vote and help people feel connected to the issues and the candidates. And so if you're talking about precinct 279 or 489 or whatever, that is your neighborhood precinct. And there are several hundred in Travis County, I'm sure, and there's 100 or so in Williamson County. And then we have the precincts that correspond to the constable precincts, and those precincts sort of map onto the county commissioner. So when you're looking at the constable precincts, you're just going to have 1, 2, 3, or 4 or 5. And so those should be also indicated on your voter registration card. If you still have that in your possession, it should say constable precinct and also your voter precinct.
Right, that's a great explanation. Good point. A few other comments. Homeless camps, persons experiencing homelessness, huge issue. Definitely that touches policymakers and also law enforcement, who often are the ones called and have to deal with that. And what kind of training they have, if they will show up, if they're called for issues like that, could be a very important topic. Being support teams that offer alternatives to 911 for people with mental health crises and people experiencing homelessness. Great. So do they have specialized officers that will respond to a mental health call that have extra training on de-escalation and that would know how to handle that? Very good point. Profiling, especially in light of SB 4. This is the special election, I believe, bill that basically says local law enforcement can enforce immigration status and can deport people essentially. So, have a law enforcement officer determine just by seeing someone whether they were a citizen or not. So do they have training in bias, for example? Decriminalizing marijuana. So law enforcement can't decriminalize, and they have to be very careful. They can't really come out and say, we won't enforce the law. But certainly sometimes you can read about, they might say something like, we want to put our resources on important issues like murder. And that kind of reading between the lines is like, well, we don't want to waste time going after marijuana. It'd probably be very unlikely you would hear a law enforcement officer say, we're not doing it. Now, prosecutors, they are more likely maybe to say that. So it's a little different, but all very, very good issues. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the group that I think some people find the most intimidating to vote for, and that's the judicial races. So while we're going through this, there's something we always say about judges. They should have a good demeanor. They should have a lot of integrity. They should be ethical. So, but those are all big words. Like, what does that actually mean when we're looking for who we want to vote? And how in the world will we figure that out? The most confusing thing about the courts is there are so many levels. Texas has one of the most complicated court systems in the United States, just by the many different types of courts. But I want to break it down. I want you to think of two specific types of courts. We're going to talk about trial courts and appellate courts. Okay, so trial courts are probably the ones you're more familiar with. If you watch TV, this is Judge Judy, this is Law and Order, this is Suits. So that one business wants to sue another business, they go to a trial court. You get a traffic ticket, you go to a trial court. Murder goes to a trial court. They're all different types of trial courts, but that's one style of court. The other style of court is the appellate court, appellate law. You don't really see TV shows about this because it's a lot of like reading books. So it's maybe not as spicy as some of the other stuff. But for example, the Supreme Court is appellate court. In other words, trial courts is where a case is first filed and heard, and witnesses give testimony. A judge or a jury decides if you're guilty or not guilty, or if you're liable or not liable if it's a civil suit. But appellate courts, they just review procedures and decisions that the trial court makes to make sure that they're fair and the proper law was applied. They don't retry the case. They don't hear new evidence. They don't hear witnesses. There's no jury. So they just want to make sure that the trial courts didn't mess up, essentially. And you might want to choose really different types of people for these different types of courts because it takes a different management style. So this is what the whole system of courts look like. We're not going to go super in depth because we are limited in time. We want you to be able to go to work tomorrow, but essentially, I'm going to start at the bottom. So the lowest level of court is justice courts, justices of the peace. You may have been to a justice court because if you get a traffic ticket, that goes to justice court. If you sue your neighbor because their fence fell down in your yard, justice court. Evictions go to justice court. So these are misdemeanors punished by fine only. You can't put somebody in jail as a JP. Civil actions, in other words, lawsuits of $20,000 or less, and evictions. And then we go up to county level courts. So there's also municipal courts, but they're not elected. So we're going to skip talking about those for this time. County level courts are county court at law. And they're very similar to justice courts. It's just the next jurisdiction up. So they hear class A and B misdemeanors, which can have jail time, county jail time. And they hear lawsuits and civil actions, depending on the court, up to $250,000. So same kinds of cases, just bigger. And then we have district courts. These are felony courts. So, you know, murder or DUI or some really serious crimes go here. And big civil courts, big, like you're suing for $1 million, different things like that. So those are all the trial courts in Texas, and they're all going to be on your ballot, or at least most of them will be. And then we have the Court of Appeals. Court of Appeals is on the ballot. So if somebody says, this wasn't fair, let's appeal it, it would go to the Court of Appeals as the next step, and they would write an opinion on it and look at case law, and their opinion would become case law. And then up at the top, Texas is one of only 2 states that has 2 top courts instead of 1. The Court of Criminal Appeals hears all criminal, and the Supreme Court hears all civil. Now, what's important about the appellate courts is that big issues like abortion, for example, are heard at least the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of Texas. Is this law constitutional, essentially? So when you hear the women that sued in district court and said this law was unconstitutional, the district judge said, I agree with you, then it goes up to the appellate court and then up to the Supreme Court. It keeps going if they keep taking it. So for the appellate courts, you may actually want to select someone that has a history of being on the side of certain policies that you agree with. I would say the 2 hottest topics are Supreme Court abortion and Court of Criminal Appeals, the death penalty. But Court of Criminal Appeals could also hear an appeal if someone was charged with murder for abortion. That hasn't happened yet, but it could. Okay, so we're not going to give you a quiz over that, but there are a whole bunch of things on the ballot. Lots of Supreme Court places, lots of Court of Criminal Appeals, lots of third appeals courts. So what I was most wanting to put here is I think why people are really intimidated is they think, look, I'm not a lawyer or I don't have in-depth knowledge of what torts are. And so I look at these candidates and I can't tell who to select. They all sound good. They all have law degrees, blah, blah, blah. So I want to give you some thoughts on how you can think about selecting judges. So for one thing, you can look at the professional experience. So different kinds of courts hear different kinds of things, right? So if you're on the Court of Appeals, you're going to hear both civil and criminal. So you might want someone that has legal experience in both of those topics. So looking at their professional experience is definitely one thing to look at. Secondly, their personal history. In court, they deal with all kinds of people. You may feel it's very important for them to have a varied life experience where they've been around all different kinds of people so that they have a certain type of empathy in how they're handling their cases. That's also a very valid reason. You may want to look at endorsements. I always do this. Newspapers will often do judicial endorsements. So the Austin American Statesman does them, Austin Chronicle. But for these statewide races, like the Supreme Court and the CCA are statewide, you can look at the Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle, things like that. You just want to make sure that the endorsement group you're looking at is someone who your values align with. And then you can also look at things like I have a friend who votes for judges based on what boards and volunteer experience they do. And the reason she does that is because she feels like you have to have a certain management style that's good to be on a board. And if you're volunteering in the community, you're really coming face to face with all kinds of people. To me, that is a perfectly legitimate and valid reason to vote for a judge. Another friend always looks to see if the judge potentially has teaching experience. And she just, I do that because it's hard to handle a classroom. And I can figure if you can handle a classroom, you can handle a court. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's what you should do, but I'm just giving you some tips that there's all kinds of different frameworks you can look at to vote for judges. It doesn't have to be in-depth legal knowledge on this. Okay, so we have a question. How many places on the Texas Supreme Court and our Court of Criminal Appeals appointed by the governor? So they're actually all elected. However, if somebody retires or ages out, because there is a max age, I think it's 76. It's mid-70s, then you're forced into retirement and the governor can appoint someone for the rest of your term. And then you have to turn around and run for the next time. So everyone is elected, but just like there's a chance that you could be appointed if the term isn't finished. Mm-hmm. Good question. Okay, so we have district courts. Now this is very interesting because in Williamson County, district courts hear both civil and criminal. They do not divide them up by topic. But in Travis, we have civil courts and criminal courts. They're separated and the judge runs for them particularly. So keep that in mind depending on where you live. But a civil district court hears divorce, child custody, contract disputes, medical malpractice, torts, that's like suing maybe because you slipped, for example, and debt claim cases. So what might you be looking for? Do they have experience in those topics? Do they really believe in letting people who don't have attorneys be able to access the justice court system, self-represented litigants? Are they good at management skills? These are big, heavy courts. Do they have a good demeanor and ethics and integrity? Criminal district courts, drug cases, all the way up to capital murder. So again, types of experience. You might also want to think about their opinion on incarceration. Are they the kind of person that wants to, metaphorically throw the book at them, give them the max sentences, or are they more interested in diversion programs for different types of things, docket management, demeanor, things like that? So you'll have quite a few up, right, Felicia?
Yeah, we have 4 of our 6 district courts up for election in this year. But you'll notice from the slide that we have no Democratic candidates on this particular ballot on these for these races. So if you are very, very, very interested in the makeup of the district courts, your best chance at influence will be on this particular voting in the Republican ballot for this particular. I mean, you can't split it up, but in this, if you want to participate in the primary and you really want to influence the courts, especially at the district level, then you might want to choose the Republican ballot so that you can choose between the candidates there, because we don't have anybody running in the primary for the Democratic ballot.
And it's the exact opposite in Travis County. If you're interested in the courts, then you want to look at the Democratic ballot because we don't have any Republicans running on them. Mm-hmm. And again, you'll notice that in Williamson County, they just say district court, and in Travis, they say civil or criminal because they only hear those kinds of cases. So that is the top of the trial court. The next category down is county court at law. They hear A and B misdemeanors, so less time in jail. Civil cases below 200,000. And there's a special court called a probate court that only hears mental health cases. Okay, so that's a special one. Self-represented litigants, do they really work on access to justice issues? How do they feel about bail and bond conditions? That's a big issue. Some people feel that we need to set really high bail for certain people. Some people think bond conditions, i.e. things they have to do, like check in with an officer or, for example, use a breathalyzer if it's a DUI. A rehabilitation, those diversion courts instead, docket management, and again, demeanor and integrity. And then we have the lowest level court, but they like to say the most important court. We don't mean lowest as in least, often called the people's court, because most people that go to JP court are not represented by an attorney. They just go themselves. A class C misdemeanors like traffic, also like if you catch too many fish, things like that. Evictions, civil suits less than 20,000. Magistrate duties like signing warrants, and administrative hearings. And those are things like towing or dangerous dogs that bite, cruelty to animals, things like that. So
Jessica, can we also mention that since we just came out of Valentine's Day, JP offices also do weddings. That was where I did my marriage, so it's worth mentioning.
Yeah. They do weddings, so that's the most fun duty, I think they would say. So we only got one county court at law position up in Williamson. It looks like just the GOP ballot, correct?
Yeah. Yes, correct.
And we do have 3 up in Travis, but note that third one, the probate court, only hears mental health cases, and the number 8 and 9 are going to hear all kinds of cases. And then we have a justice of the peace up. Justice of the peace don't normally run in presidential years. They're a governor year position. However, someone moved up to a different court. So this was someone appointed and now they've got to run. So it's a competitive race in Precinct 5, Travis County. Okay, so we talked about demeanor, integrity, ethics. I feel like those are words we throw out a lot. What do they mean to you? And when we were talking about different things you can think about voting for judges, did any of those make sense to you? Or do you have something you look for that you would like to share with the group? If so, pop it in the chat. Anybody want to give us your tips? Well, if you're still thinking about it, when we go into the next category, I'll read them out at the end. Ethics, will they recuse themselves? This is a very interesting and important thing. So essentially there are certain cases where you should not roll because maybe you know someone, like you can't hear your son when he comes into court, right? So there are all these legal rules on when you can't hear a case. However, it's a weird gray area where it's not necessarily against the law if you don't recuse. It's more like ethics. And so there has been a case on the Supreme Court where certain justices have not recused themselves when other people thought they should have. And without getting too much into who that is, there's some Texas Tribune articles on it if you're interested. So I think that's a very good category of ethics. Like, you don't have to do this, but it certainly makes people feel like justice isn't served, you know, if you are friends, you know, something like this. So great one. Anything else? Okay, well, moving into our last category, we're calling them public administrators. So when we move through here, I want you to think about what kind of skill set do you think is important? Because public administrators generally manage really large offices or staffs. And so they maybe have a need for more like CEO type skills. Back to our judges, experience in a particular area would be very important for me in choosing a candidate, such as mental health. If they were in that probate court, do they have experience hearing those types of cases? Very true and good opinion there. Okay, well, there's only a State Board of Education person up in Williamson. So Felicia, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. We have on the slide here that we have somebody on the GOP ballot and the Dem ballot. I should say first, as you can see from the slide, District 10 is enormous. It's 27 counties. So this covers a huge chunk of Central Texas. And when we're looking at this, at the ballot, one of the strange things this election is that we have one person who is running on both the Republican and the Democratic primary ballots, and he's also on the Green Party and Libertarian ballots. I have no idea how this is happening, and there's a lot of discussion going on up here about what this could possibly mean. But it leads us to a very interesting ballot. Either way you look, you're going to have him on the ballot. So, you know, that gives you options, I guess, if he's your candidate. And in any case, there are candidates for both parties here.
Yeah, and Travis County, number 5 is not up this time. They rotate who on the State Board of Education is up. And what that role does is they kind of set curriculum. You often hear in the news about them selecting textbooks. And by reading this, you might think this should be kind of an uncontroversial role, but it's actually right at the head of a lot of controversy over education. Like what kinds of curriculum. For example, in the last go round, they took out the requirement to teach about MLK. So there's a lot of like these hot button social issues that tend to pop up on State Board of Education, unfortunately. Railroad commissioner. This is always my favorite one to talk about because it has nothing to do with the railroads, and it's sneaky that they haven't changed the name. Many years ago, like in the 1870s, it was the position that regulated the railroads, but then the railroads all got nationalized, so there's not a state need to regulate them. And instead, it moved over to regulating oil, gas, alternative fuels, pipeline safety, surface mining, and reclamation. There's been movement for many years to change the title of this, and it's always shot down. I think that's really unfortunate, and I suspect it's because they think people might not care as much about the railroad commissioner as the commissioner of oil, gas, pipeline safety. So, but now that you know what it is, that can help you select a candidate. Going back. So this is a statewide position. So no matter where you live, as long as you're in Texas, you'll be voting on this. So the kind of issues that you might care about is, do you want oil, gas, fuels regulated more, or do you want it regulated less? And wherever you fall on that may have you select who you want to vote for. And there's people running in both primaries for that one. Also, there are 3 commissioners, and they're not all up at the same time. There's just one commissioner this time. They're kind of like on a rotating basis. So every 2 years, a different one will be up. And finally, not last but not least, the tax assessor collector, which they always want to say we do not set the tax rate, we only collect it, because they get a lot of angry phone calls saying, why did you make my taxes so high? They do calculate property tax rate for the county. They collect it. They collect taxes for cities, schools, different things. They process motor vehicle title transfers and vehicle registration and licenses, boat titles. In some counties, they register voters, and that they do that in Travis County, but they do not conduct elections. How is it broken down in Williamson, Felicia?
No, we have an elections administrator who runs elections up here. So elections don't fall under the tax assessor's office.
I generally think that's in very rural counties, they probably do both. But in
Yeah.
large counties like both of ours, there's the county clerk in Travis and the elections administrator in Williamson. But that is where you turn in the voter registrations. And many of you that are VDRs are probably familiar with this office way more than the general public. So thinking about that, looks like they're up on both, but only GOP ballot in Williamson.
That's right.
Only Democratic ballot, and it's sorry, that should say Travis County at the bottom, not Williamson. It's a typo on my so thinking of that, some of the issues surrounding tax assessor are management. They have really large offices, technology, they have a ton of software systems, like they have to really be good at records management. They're handling all our money, they're handling all our title transfers. Another really big one is customer service, because if you want to get your title transferred or something, you want someone who's helpful, and you don't want it to be all this red tape you have to jump through. So more of the management end of things. So looking at that, I know those are very different roles, but for public administrators, what kind of skill set do you think is important? If anybody wants to pop it in the chat. Let's see, we got a question here. Who could pass legislation to require picking one party on a ballot to run? Assuming that would be the state representatives and state senators, it might be a constitutional thing. It sounds like it's a real gray area, and I'm wondering if this individual in the State Board of Education wins more than one primary, if that will actually go up to the courts and they'll see and they'll rule on it. Felicia, is that your thought there?
I really don't know. Ultimately, the counties have the final say over their ballots. And so it might be even a ruling at the county level that allows him to run in all four.
So maybe he's on in some counties and not in others, since it's also complicated.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, so kind of a conundrum there. So a good point who posted that. I think that's one where you might say, watch and see what's going to happen there. Yes, the Travis County tax assessor is on the ballot, but it is uncontested. But again, you always have the option to not vote at all for that race if you don't like the candidate, for example. Some skill set managing people, yes, like the tax assessor collector, they have huge staff, you know, so they need to be good at human resources and also like managing the public, which can be fun or not, depending on if you think your property tax bill was too high. All right, anything else? Any other skill sets you think are important? Okay, well, hopefully we've done a good job at giving you a very broad overview of what the roles and responsibilities are for folks running. I know it's a lot. We have one of the longest ballots in the United States. Most states do not have as many judges and courts that you have to vote on. We are totally aware and we sympathize that it's complicated. But hopefully presentations like this help a little bit, and then especially the voter's guide, because you can hear from candidates in their own words. And say you read it and you think, oh, all three of these candidates are great. Now what do I do? We do have a link there for their websites. Of course, they can put a lot more information on their website, so you might go and see what their personal experience is, where they volunteer, all kinds of things. Additionally, if you don't get a printed copy, my favorite thing to do is to go to Vote 411 because then it just puts in what I can vote for, what's going to be applicable to me, because this has all the races and it can get really intimidating when you go, I'm not really sure which precinct I'm in. So vote411.org will give you the specifics. Yes, I have it there. And let's see, let me make sure. Yes, someone said, thank goodness for Vote 411, so we only have to see what will be on our ballot. Travis and Williams
Yes.
don't have the longest ballot. Usually that goes to Harris County that can have over 90 races on the ballot. So wow. That is a lot. All
One
right.
last point, Jessica, about what the candidates say. When our voters guide people reach out to the candidates, just know that the candidates don't always respond. And so sometimes you will see that there are candidates listed who have provided no answers. And that's not because we've ignored them, it's because the candidates have chosen not to respond. So, again, when we go and talk to high school students, we tell them that in itself is an answer of sorts because they're not willing to tell you about themselves. And so just keep that in mind as you're looking through as well. If you have the printed guide in front of you, you'll be able to see, okay, I can see all of the candidates who responded to these questions. And, 3 of them just didn't even show up, something like that. So that's just another data point to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you go to Vote 411, it'll ask you if you want to see the Republican ballot or the Democratic ballot. You can look at both of them and maybe see if your particular precinct has more action going on in one or the other. Again, you don't have to be registered under a particular party or consider yourself of that party to vote in the primary. It could just be that you're very interested in certain competitive races. Well, thank you all. I know that you've taken time out of your Thursday, post-Valentine's Day, to join us. Early voting does start next week, so we're very excited. Also, this presentation, we are going to keep giving it to different groups that request over the summer because, of course, after the primary, we have the general coming up and almost all the races will be contested at that point. And we'll even have Libertarian and Green candidates on the ballot as well. So if you are with a nonprofit or another group, a neighbor group or something who would be interested in having this presentation, we do have folks go out into the community to give that, and we'd be happy to do that. Just be sure and reach out to us early because we probably won't have the bandwidth to do that in October of next year, late September, as we'll be doing a whole bunch of election stuff. But over the summer would be a very great time. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much. We are going to put this on our YouTube. So if anyone would be interested in it but couldn't attend tonight, they can watch that later. Well, thank you so much, Felicia, for co-hosting. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jessica.
All right, everybody. Again, thank you, and we will see you later.